It's my pleasure to introduce the Great Animal Orchestra and the beginning of our fall 2012 public programming season. The poet Kenneth Patchen once said, "I am the world crier, and this is my dangerous career." This evening, it is my privilege to introduce two esteemed guests, renowned bioacoustician and author Bernie Krause, and poet, scholar, and founder of Ecopoetics, Jonathan Skinner, who have devoted their rather dangerous careers to this world cry and to the questions that emerge when you begin to attend to the earth in its entirety. I oversee a modest little corner of that soundscape, a poetry audio archive here at Harvard, and it has been a part of the privilege of that work to be able to listen to whole generations of poets vocalizing in relationship to each other, discovering within the constraints of their era's linguistic landscape and its particular deficits of attention, new and necessary opportunities to expand the range of what can be heard and received. It has also been a part of the honor of my job not simply to preserve past audio, but to foster the creation of new works, new sonic material in the world. This evening is just such an occasion. Several months ago, the Poetry Room, the Film Study Center, and the Sensory Ethnography Lab invited Bernie and Jonathan to construct a collaborative exchange, a cross-disciplinary, cross-the-country call and response, which they have graciously agreed to share with us this evening. It is my hope that this program will help attune us to the dense fabric of activity that surrounds us. How, as Renee Shar writes, in our gardens, forests are preparing. Please welcome Bernie Krause and Jonathan Skinner.
I listen for the near and the far, the middle field, to left and to right. Does hearing have directions? A compass for the ears. The high frequencies are healing. Events chatter. Whistling adds sweetness. A distant, man-like animal call, ordering the dark, sounds the woody shapes. The insects of the song unearthed. Listen as though you had never heard a sleep machine. Ignore the insistent fall, from right to left, back across and out, pulling in even as it's breaking and pushing. Can you hear, without seeing what's far away, the hissing of space between atoms? Principles of symmetry seem to be in force. Why does a glacier sound like a sea anemone? Mountain-sized ice slugs bump and skid toward the desert. Falling wedges displace mountain ranges of ocean. What sounds living is sliding, the very mass. No one hears the white noise of the public announcement. It all seems very far away. And what is that man with a microphone doing in a crevasse? You want to ask him, was he really thrown 15 feet in the air? Did he invent the coexistence of these sounds? Intensified into symbols, hard to locate through headphones, in need of translation, an insect arabesque marks the top of the field, a birdie trim. Who knew knuckles on gorilla pecs could sound like lips, human voices like a watermark? I fed my earbone to an anemone. The grunt it recorded defies all scale. Are all the sounds of life mechanical? Now I wear it around my neck, an inscription, a vibration, a transmission. We conduct a public hearing of the savannah. Step up to the microphone and testify. Chew, rattle, growl, pop. Do not fear the recordist, for he is in his sarcophagus dreaming of your speech. Do not fear the lion, for his cries encircle your valley. Though you are many, you will go on one record, how you follow in one another's silences. The internal combustion engine is the fundamental sound of contemporary civilization. It is the keynote, as surely as water was the keynote of thalassocratic civilization, and the wind is the keynote of the steppes. R. Murray Schafer. Also, a free ringtone from www.climatechange.com. It is easy to get lost in what this sound represents. The poles are melting. We have filled the atmosphere with our stories, and still we cram in more. The delicacy of our planet makes its own noise. Can we listen to listen? Some voices seem to speak to us from a realm just beyond the living, harboring an eloquence our schools and operas only approximate. Breath is psychic, hence its connection with the departed. We share the plane of the edges of the cut reed, of those who make instruments of their wind, a technique of hearing, to sound, to listen. Are you sending? Are you receiving? Pauline Oliveros. Across the vast differences between us, whales and humans and birds, something listens, pauses, then picks up again.
The Great Animal Orchestra is the story of how animals taught us to dance and sing. And it's one of the many narratives revealed to us through the voice of the natural world. It's Soundscape. One of the neat things about Soundscape is it reveals a lot of stories that are important to our understanding of the world around us. And in the natural soundscape, we have so many disciplines that relate to the ways in which the natural soundscape is expressed. We can talk about it from a perspective of music, and certainly in this new book, I've limited the subject to how we became musical. Just as easily, I could have focused on medicine, the healing properties of natural sound, or religion, how natural sound informed spirituality. But I could have talked about physics or ornithology or natural history, literature, botany, and in the case of this evening, certainly poetry. The story in my book begins at the end of the last ice age and brings us to an overview of Western musical literature and its relationships to the natural wild. I began this process when my late music partner, Paul Beaver, and I were invited by Warner Brothers to do an album called In a Wild Sanctuary. And because I don't have great vision, by the way, my world has largely been informed by sound. And I began my career as a musician, moving from violin to guitar to synthesizer in the process. In a Wild Sanctuary was the first album ever to explore the theme of ecology. And with Paul Beaver, my late music partner, we created one of the earliest experiments using whole natural soundscapes as components of orchestration. And I might add that the first time that I went out to the woods to record natural sounds was as a result of being engaged to do this album. And when I switched on the recorder for the first time with stereo microphones in 1968 in a woods not far from San Francisco, it was an epiphany for me. It changed my life. And I decided I didn't want to spend another minute indoors. I wanted to spend the rest of my life outside in the field recording animal sounds. So that's how I got started. But let's explore some ideas here that I've discovered along the way. This is the first page of Beethoven's Fifth, and it's a 90-second lesson in how to conduct Beethoven. And what I want to show you here is that what we are doing in music is composing it, laying out the page from the lowest note to the highest note, the basses to the flutes, and time, of course, reads from left to right. Well, how did we get this kind of organization? What is it about the organization of music and our connection to it that we found from the natural world? Before I get into that, I want to just show you a spectrogram. And a spectrogram is a graphic of sound. It's a graphic illustration of sound. And you'll notice that the instruments in the spectrogram, I'm going to play this little piece for you. It's 11 bars of music, but you notice the basses here on the bottom, just like in the Beethoven score that I showed you, and the flute's all the way on the top here. So I'm going to play this, and we'll follow the line as it goes along. Okay. Think of these lines as lines on a musical staff, and you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about here. But let's talk about the soundscape for a second. The soundscape was first identified by a friend of mine and great composer, Canadian composer by the name of R. Murray Schafer, and he wrote a book called Tuning of the World in 1977. It's one of the best books on sound and music you'll ever want to read, and I recommend it highly for those of you who are interested in this subject. Well, what is it about the soundscape that, how does it come to us? How is it revealed to us? Well, basically it comes from three sources. And the first of those is the geophony, geo meaning the earth, sounds of the earth, and phone from the Greek word for sound. And these are the non-biological natural sounds that occur, like the effects of wind, weather, water, geophysical sounds, like earthquakes and avalanches. And that's the first component. This is the first sound on Earth, first sound any organism heard. And any organism that evolved out of the ooze of the water that it evolved in had to be able to find a niche for itself so its voice could be heard. And the critter sounds are called the biophony, bio meaning life, and phone, of course, meaning sound again. It's a non-human critter sound from wild habitats. I pretty much eliminate domestic animals like dogs and cats and cows and stuff like that. And the third is anthrophony. It's the noise we introduce into the world. Some of it is controlled noise, like theater or music. But a lot of it is physiological, like our talking and grunting and body sounds that we make, electromechanical sounds like automobiles and buses, those kinds of things, leaf blowers that we introduce into the wild, jet planes flying over, and incidental sounds like walking and our clothes rustling. The biophony, for me, is the most important because that's what informs us about how we're doing in relationship to the natural world. Excuse me. It posits that in many wild habitats, creatures vocalize in special relationships with one another, just like instruments in an orchestra, like the music I just showed you earlier. In this partitioning of critter voices into time and frequency bandwidth is a really important concept to get because it gives us great tools to evaluate our relationships to this natural world of ours. And it was biophony, of course, that first inspired humans to dance and sing. I want to show you what a biophony looks like. Think of this, again, as a measure of music. These as lines on a musical staff. And we have here the Malaysian-eared nightjar down here in the bottom. Think of him as one of the celli. We have the chestnut-winged babbler. Think of him as one of the violins. And insects up here doing this long hold. And notice that they all stay out of each other's way. The Malaysian-eared nightjar is down here, chestnut-winged babbler is up here, and the cicada, this guy, has figured out how to play 3 notes at the same time, staying out of any of the other places that are filled with sound. And here's what it's to our ears, because we don't know really how to listen, we're a visual culture. To our ears, it sounds kind of like a cacophony, but take a look at this. Okay, we've got frogs, insects, birds, mammals, and they're all fitting in relationship to one another. And notice also, this guy right here, as soon as the cicada stops singing, within a nanosecond, the Malaysian-eared nightjar comes in. And again, it stops, and then the cicada comes in. So we're talking about temporal and frequency niches that are established in healthy habitats. Well, what else can it teach us? Here's a spectrogram from Lincoln Meadow, which is a meadow that Jonathan and I have both been at in the Sierras, about 4.5-hour drive from San Francisco to the east. And there's a graduate student of mine that noted that this looks kind of like an impressionistic painting of a forest. Well, this is the place that we recorded, this picture here in the lower right. And what's happening here is you'll notice that this is before selective logging. And we were told that selective logging was going to have no impact on the natural soundscape or anything else there. And so we asked them if we could record in 1988 before they did the selective logging, and this is what we found. Okay, and this is what it looks like. Well, selective logging was done that summer, and a year later we went back to record to find this. A lot of it's gone, and we went back 15 times since, and we have pretty much the same thing. The density and diversity are gone. They've changed radically. To our eye, the place looks exactly the same. And that's, but the soundscape tells a very different story. Here's the sound now. That's a Williamson sapsucker. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, you've heard that old trope. Well, I think a soundscape is worth 1,000 pictures because it really tells a very different story. And Aldo Leopold once mentioned, he said, you know, if you're going to tamper with nature, you better keep all the parts. And I'd also recommend that you keep the schematics and the building plans too, because we don't know much what we're doing when we're messing around with this stuff. This is another example. This is a marine environment, coral reefs. And you'll notice in this spectrogram, just in the lower half of the page, these are all the surface wave noise sounds. And we've got 11 species of fish in the upper side, in the upper part of the spectrogram. And this is what a coral reef sounds like when it's alive. A quarter of a mile away on the same reef, the reef was dying, and this is what it looks like in a spectrogram. And this is what it sounds like. The snapping sounds you hear are snapping shrimp that are still living in the area. They're a tiny shrimp, which I'll describe a little bit later. Here's another example of natural sounds. There's a lot of resistance to anthropomorphism. We all know that. It's the old Cartesian trope that do animals have feelings or emotion? Of course, we were told that they don't. But emotional expression, happiness or sadness, is a very important component of natural sound, and in many cases, non-human animals. And it's also very much a part of our music. Well, what inspired us to formulate sound in that way? A pair of fish and wildlife guys walked into a scene where a colleague of mine had been recording in Minnesota for a dozen or so years. He'd been recording around this particular habitat, this lake, and the lake was formed by a beaver dam at one end. And these two guys came in and dropped a couple of sticks of dynamite down the beaver dam and blew it up and killed the mother and the infants. And he kept on recording that day, and that evening he came back to the pond to find the male swimming in circles, wounded and crying out in a way I've never heard a beaver cry before, because I've heard the tail slaps and I've heard certain sounds like grunts that the beaver would make, but never anything like this. Lauren Isley once said, "I have never entered a wood but what I hear footsteps in the leaves tiptoeing away." How did animals get their sounds? Well, some actually learned them from sounds they hear in the geophony, the non-human sounds that come from the earth. And here's a perfect example of how certain critters at both poles, never come in contact with one another, have picked up their voices, we think. What I'm going to play for you is the electrical energy of thunderstorms that occur at the equator that are transmitted through the magnetic field of the Earth to both poles. And this is what the electrical energy of those thunderstorms sounds like. They're called whistlers, and NASA records them with low-frequency radio receivers in the Antarctic and the Arctic. This was recorded in the Antarctic. Remember, this is the electrical energy of thunderstorms. Just to give you an idea. Well, this little fellow somehow managed to create a voice that's very similar. How did he do that? And this guy lives 10,000 miles away. Listen to his voice. It actually sounds electronic to me. I mean, it's just so weird. But here's an example of how we connected with the natural world, and there are groups of humans living in the natural world, much more closely connected, of course, than we are. People like the Bayaka, who live in the Central African Republic, and that Louis Sarno has been capturing since 1984. And this example is another spectrogram, and think of these as lines on a musical staff. And you'll see the flute all down here. But what this guy is doing is he's playing to the rhythm of this frog right here, which we can't hear because we're not trained to hear that kind of discrimination. But check this out. Again, he's playing to the frog. Okay. But we also learned to dance with the deer, the buffalo, the bear, and all these are really important because that's our connection to the natural world. It's a real connection. But in the West, how did we ever come to nature and the idea of connecting to nature and sound? Well, we've messed around with a lot. Most of what I've found is that we've taken these ideas and abstracted them, disconnected ourselves, and abstracted them from the natural world. In the case of birds, there are 3,500 different species of birds, maybe more, but only 100 of them have been ever been used in music. Why? Well, there's some good reasons for that. But here's an idea of Ivaldi expressing spring. Now play this for a 15-year-old and ask him what it represents musically. Same thing with this. This is Debussy. Okay. And Hovhannes and Krum are writing about the same animal. Here's their impressions. Sorry. And here's George Krum. Same animal. Anybody who actually doesn't know the music want to guess what they are? They're the Humpback Whale. All right? Here's Messiaen. Messiaen traveled through the woods of France with his wife Yvonne, just notating the birds that happened to fit the musical paradigms of the academy that he understood. All the other birds were left out in the cold. But he did capture some wonderful stuff, and I love his music. I'm just saying that, I'm just asking the question, is this really connected to the natural world? But here's Messiaen. That's part of chromochromy. These Western musical paradigms and the birds that we take out of context and the animals, we've only done, look what we've done. The signature animals are the birds, whales, and wolves. And only certain whales, humpback whales, because they're the most musical of all. But here's an example of what we've been doing as musicians. This is the common potu that is a very jazzy bird, and it can be found from Costa Rica down south into the Amazon basin. Common potu. Really bluesy. Now you can certainly write a piece of music to that. Here's the musician wren. Now the musician wren, Jonathan played earlier as part of the piece. And what's happening here is this guy goes through this riff, this musical riff that he established, the theme, and then just at the end of a phrase, a parrot interrupts him, and he stops, lets the parrot do its thing, And as soon as the parrot stops, he picks up the theme right where he left off. Check this out. Here comes the parrot. Watch this. Amazing. Well, we all know that those two are musical. What about this one? My wife, Kat, and I were in Ecuador recently, and we dropped a couple of microphones down the hollow of this tree, and there were two tiny baby vultures. They could fit in the palm of your hand sitting at the bottom of this tree, the hollow. Why isn't this musical? These are babies. You don't want to put your hand down there. Okay, what's especially interesting about this is these birds are using the hollow of that trunk as an instrument. In other words, they're using it to amplify their voices. Isn't that cool? I mean, I think that's incredibly cool. We always talk about human beings being the only ones who use tools. Well, these critters could teach us some lessons. And this whole slide reminds me of Luc Ferry's expression. He says, "Nature is beautiful when it imitates art." Yeah. Well, I want to close this little section with just some more ideas for you guys out there and gals. In 2006, we went to the Arctic to record in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We were told by many politicians that there was nothing there because they wanted to drill. And so obviously we went there to find out if there was nothing there. And we recorded in 3 spots. We recorded on the Beaufort Sea, right at the edge of the sea ice there. And we recorded upslope. This is the Brooks Range right here. And the North Slope is this part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that's referred to as the North Slope. And then I was south of the Brooks Range in the tundra at the western end of the boreal forest, which stretches from the Maritimes all the way to Alaska. And I just want to play you some of the nothing that we found there. This is Timber Lake where I recorded. These are tree sparrows, white-crowned sparrows, redpolls, and the ground squirrel. Nothing much there. And here's Sunset Pass facing north. These are blue throats, Smith's longspur, redpolls, and sparrows. I guess nothing left that horn there either. And here's the Beaufort Sea, right at the edge of the Beaufort Sea. And you can see just to the south there, this is 70 miles away, this is the Brooks Range to the south. These are phalaropes, longspurs, sandpipers. And a lot of wind. And finally, that isn't what I wanted. Finally, I just wanted to say all of this is included and more in the Great Animal Orchestra, which is the book. And I thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Bernie. Yeah, I'm going to switch over here.
Okay.
And while we transition, just wanted to thank Christina for organizing this event and this conversation. It's been really interesting dialogue that Bernie and I have been having. I'll have to apologize for reading my portion in contradistinction to Bernie's extempore style, but try to make it engaging. Here you are. Okay. Ecopoetics as discrepant engagement, sounding the animal. Sound I like to think of as the true north of ecopoetics, not the only significant dimension of an environmental poetics, but often a reliable way to get oriented. A compass point for a compass point for thinking, writing, speaking to get their bearings in a more than human world. An ecopoetics attends first by listening, whatever be its other vectors of engagement. Before it is polluted, the river wants to be heard, writes Cecilia Vicuña. Listening can be understood as a stance of participatory receptiveness, as much as an oral faculty. We can listen with our eyes, or we can sound with science. It is difficult to be responsible to an environment if we have not first listened in to find out who and what is present. The idea I'm working with here, or maybe it's just an observation, is that sound, and especially the acousmatic object of recorded sound, what Hildegard Westerkamp calls the naked ear of the microphone, connects us to at the same time that it disconnects us from the environment, offering a texture for what poet Nathaniel Mackey calls forms of discrepant engagement. And the doubleness of this disconnected connection, or this connected disconnection, reflects any kind of attempt to record or translate the natural world into human media, or any kind of transaction between differing systems, for that matter. It also helps us understand why Wittgenstein's famous statement, "If a lion could talk, we would not understand him," is not an injunction to stop listening to lions or to not sound them in our poems. Let me quote Mackey at some length here. Discrepant engagement, he writes, is an expression coined in reference to practices that, in the interest of opening presumably closed orders of identity and signification, accent fissure, fracture, incongruity, the rickety, imperfect fit between word and world. Such practices highlight, indeed inhabit, discrepancy, engage rather than seek to ignore it. Recalling the derivation of the word discrepant from a root meaning to rattle, creak, I relate discrepant engagement to the name the Dogon of West Africa give their weaving block, the base on which the loom they weave upon sits. They call it the creaking of the word. It is the noise upon which the word is based, the discrepant foundation of all coherence and articulation, of the purchase upon the world that fabrication affords. Discrepant engagement, rather than suppressing or seeking to silence that noise, acknowledges it. In its anti-foundational acknowledgement of founding noise, discrepant engagement sings bass, voicing reminders of the axiomatic exclusions upon which positings of identity and meaning depend. End quote. That's the longest quote in the talk. What interests me in other than human vocalizations is precisely the extent to which they too can mean, even in a discrepant, noisy way, without necessarily telling a story that we recognize easily in human terms. For the poet in the field of non-human vocalizations, attempting to notice and translate these vocalizations into human language, the challenge is to do so without too readily ascribing a human story to them, and without claiming that all animal vocalization is poetry, for that matter. To let them, in a way, dehumanize our own language before we try to make them familiar in our own world. This care extends to more than vocalizations, of course, to non-vocalized sounds, including geophony and plant sounds. We're still looking for a word for plant sounds. Yeah, I'm working on it. Good narratives familiarize us with unknown material, while good poems defamiliarize what we think we know. That's way too simplistic a way of putting it, but a bold index for a useful distinction. A poetics alive to the discrepancy of its own engagements, I think, is ready to do work at this sensitive site. Consider poet Michael McClure, who infamously read poetry to a lion at the zoo, reading from his ghost tantras, composed in what he calls beast language. Okay.
Here's number 51 of the 99. I love to think of the red-purple rose in the darkness cooled by the night. We are served by machines making satins of sounds. Each blot of sound is a bud or a star. Body eats bouquets of the ear's vista. Booty, eyes, ears, nose, deem thou, no, na, o, Nagaru me, not through Sirch, not thee. The machines are too dull when we are lion poems that move and breathe when we grew. Andri Maikta Sharu Sridano deemed as one. Itus Ro.
Indeed. In a manifesto McClures sent fellow poet Charles Olson, he names 4 elements found in his writings. Quote, the rose flush, straight speech, exclamation, and the drift. Straight speech entails, quote, the contact and straight carryover of the feeling and creation of the physiology onto the page, as fine as blood or breathing, sureness, clarity, dark or luminous, direct, end quote. Straight speech is not about locating authenticity or voice or a natural sound. The sound words of ghost tantras do not imitate animal growls. Quote, not mimicry, but each writing a morphological existence independent except of myself. I do not duplicate the outside world, but match my desires against it from my body, end quote. Elsewhere, McClure notes that the ghost tantras are sonnets. They also embed what he calls the physicality of a more formal high art, the constraints of formal artifice not being any less embedded in their environment than supposed organic form. What McClure gets from the beats and from the action painting of abstract expressionists like Pollock and Klein is what he characterizes as an almost cellular connection with physiological core, a meeting of poetry and biology. McClure's paraphrase of the systems-based understanding of the organic runs as follows, quote, the organism is, in itself, a tissue or veil between itself and the environment. It is also simultaneously the environment itself. The organism is what Whitehead and Olson would think of as a point of novelty comprehending itself, or experiencing itself both proprioceptively and at its tissue's edges and at any of its conceivable surfaces. There is, in fact, a central force in the organism, and it is the environment. And that word proprioceptive is for that internal sensation of the body feeling itself from the inside. Biologists Maturana and Varela call this adaptive relationship between organism and environment autopoiesis, and emphasize the importance of operational closure for the autonomy of the organism. Organisms are closed and self-referential in terms of what constitutes their specific mode of existence, even as they are open to the environment on the level of their material structure. So I have a very particular organization as a human being, but I'm made of atoms and particles that are, renewing themselves every 7 years and move on to participate in other organisms. It is the very closure, the veil of the organism, that enables it to multiply points of contact with its environment and to alter its own structural states. In other words, it is only through our disconnection that we are connected to the environment. It is the very muteness of Wittgenstein's lion and or the human inability to understand the talk of the lion that makes communication not only possible, but necessary. And Vicky Hearn said of Wittgenstein's comment that was one of the most interesting mistakes she'd ever heard, because lions do talk to trainers, for instance. But she also pointed out that Wittgenstein doesn't go so far as to say that the lion doesn't have a language, it's just the lion doesn't talk. Lion is not languageless. Most relevant to the questions I have posed about McClure's beast language is systems theory's break with the representational model. If we accept such a model of communication, one that is not narrowly based on linguistic self-referentiality or the deconstructionist différance, but on communities of embodied contingency, if we accept such a model, we can open up poetics to exchanges not only across disciplines and divisions of knowledge, but also between species. The question of whether McClure's poetics is adequately sensitive to the discrepancy of his engagement, I'll leave to the eco-critics to debate. Consider another sonnet-like poem, Emily Dickinson's A Root of Evanescence. If you like Dickinson, you may know this poem. A root of evanescence with a revolving wheel, a resonance of emerald, a rush of cochineal. And every blossom on the bush adjusts its tumbled head, the mail from Tunis, probably, an easy morning's ride. What on the surface seems an imagistic portrait of a hummingbird turns out to be a rather sophisticated machine for gleaning textual flowers. As Linda Taylor and other scholars have shown, Dickinson's poem, a poem enclosed in a letter that is at least nominally about correspondence, operates a feat of condensation in relation to Shakespeare's The Tempest. one that does a lot more than merely suggest the play's atmosphere of magical illusion and pageantry, or suggest great distance through the word Tunis. Dickinson's A Root of Evanescence is a kind of writing machine where, like Prospero to his Ariel, the author yields organizational agency to the phenomena of the hummingbird, arranging human memory and association in uncanny patterns. Few critics, however, focus on the non-semantic layers of sound in the poem. That sound which the inventors of rhyme in our tradition, the 12th century Occitan troubadours, kept deliberately separate from meaning by rhyming only the ends of their words. That's right, the troubadours rarely rhymed whole words, so they were not rhyming the meaning, just rhyming the sound, the tail ends of the words, the sounds, creating patterns of sound. I'd argue that blossom heads, Dickinson's blossom heads, are words tumbled by the hummingbird, whose distance-zapping transit through the poet's hearing reorganizes phonetic structures into clusters of periodic assonance and consonants, whose resonance draws language away from its conventional literary meanings. Consider the following sound intensifications: root, rev, res; sense, nance; even, evolve, ever; wheel, kneel, male; ald, head, ride; rush, bush, adjusts; tum, ton; every, easy. These clusters revolve around a lone sound at the center of the poem, coach, whose semantic pun lies exposed, in which perhaps we hear the turning axle of the mailman's coach. Consider the electric contortions of Maggie O'Sullivan's Starlings. Tipsy baubles, dowdy, wander, halt upon grinned jeers, gins, note. Starlings may disappoint their Shakespearean legacy, considered as pests in America ever since they escaped Central Park, where they were introduced from England, as you may know, a project to introduce all the birds in Shakespeare to England. But as sound, the pitch meander ears, tune me gold, dolphy pods. As sight, they are ochre harled. Charles Bernstein has noted how O'Sullivan's poems lend themselves to recitation while resisting thematization. To carry out the instructions fixed on the page is a transformative way of discovering one's objective nature as the breath, the tongue, and lips, performing dolphy pods, undergo kinship with animals.
Starlings, lived daily or both, daily the living structuring bone seed, pelage aqueous, yonderly lazy bed of need, cloud sang, tipsy bobbles, dowdy wonder, halt upon, grinned jeers, gin's note, someone's in the leading of small and the pitch meander ears, tune me gold, dolphy pods, lipper, ochre, hard, electric contortions, clashes, perforate, all fall down, scabbed, faulty pebbles, moaning gather, pictocudes, unspill, uncounting equivalences, mono-funnily grinning, spectacular warmth so lamented, oracular hushed, brown aglue, spat-lusted, washes over let, ply city serves a gold, shake 2, 3, 4, kick vanilla, giddy feathered crinkle gown, proper little crock of frillies, rattled grapples, jingles, giblets, jangled dignitaries drenching anybody's, lower, unjointed, fell in, mimicry grid, stubborn beggar, scraping, scrapey, syncopated, iridescent magnets.
And if you read Maggie O'Sullivan's poetry and sound it aloud, it really is impossible to sing the poem without, in a sense, becoming its matter, to get the tipsy baubles, as one voices Gin's note in what O'Sullivan, she calls it a mattering of materials. Tropes of sound in ecopoetics mind the gap between acoustics and phonetics. Consider the mimesis of Lorraine Niedeker's Sora Rail's sweet spoon-tapped water glass descending scale teardrop tittle, referencing a resemblance that birders instantly recognize. And if you don't know the Sora's call, I'll just play it for you right here. Sora Rail. The mimesis of this spoon-tapped water glass descending scale teardrop tittle descends into a thicket of alliteration, ending with hyphenated and enjambed, nursery-rhymed nonsense. On the one hand, Niedeker's sounds activate the non-speech mode of poetry, attending to acoustic signals prior to their organization as words. Hearing seems to offer a bridge, however enjambed, between human and non-human. On the other hand, the meaning of teardrop tittle remains irreducibly human, an isolated sense the deafness of Niedeker's mother might be proxy for. Her mother was going deaf as she wrote this poem about her. So deafness of Niedeker's mother might be a proxy for this isolated sense. His mother, who's not hearing canvasbacks, their blast-off rise, the poet mourns. In my last example here, Nathaniel Mackie's Sound and Semblance, a poem but also an essay of that title, ruminates on Stephen Feld's anthropological work, Sound and Sentiment. Feld's book, and Bernie knows Feld and his work, Feld's book is an account of the Gisalo sung by the Kaluli of Papua New Guinea, a semi-sung, semi-spoken song that closely follows the melodic contours of the Mooney bird's cry. According to Kaluli myth, a brother and sister go fishing for crayfish, but the boy catches none, and the sister refuses to give him any of hers to eat when he pleads for some. The boy then turns into a Mooney bird, a kind of fruit dove with a purple beak, and sings a weeping song that laments this erosion of kinship. In his preface display anthem, the collection that includes this poem, Mackie refers to the song of the Mooney bird, referenced in the poem you're about to hear, as his prototype for a hybrid poetics, an art of word tones that is quintessentially elegiac, but also a cry for social healing. In this poem, besides references to Kaluli poetics, you will hear allusion to the African-American musicians Mackie borrows so many of his technical devices from, to Duke, Prez, Lester Young, Lady, Count, Pharoah Sanders. So this is where we need audio. I'm going to apologize in advance for the quality of this recording. It's not the best.
A sand-anointed wind spoke of survival. Wood scratched raw, scoured by. And of low sky poked at by branches, blown rush, thrown voice, leg bone flute. Wind we all filled up with, caught in the tree we lay underneath. Tree filled up with wind and more wind, more than could be said if it said. So-called ascendancy of shadow, branch, would-be roost, now not only a tree, more than a tree. It was the bending of boughs we'd read about, Ibn Arabi's rep to satiety, soon come condolence, pleaded son. We saved our breath, barely moved, said nothing. Soon come suzerainty, volubly afoot, braided what we read and what we heard and what stayed sailors, giggly wind, wood, riffling wool. A Moroccan reed flute's desert weeds took our breath. Floor we felt we stood on, caustic earth we rode across. It was Egypt or Tennessee we were in. No one, eyes X'd out, could say which. Fleet millenarian we it now was, whose arrival the wind announced. Night found us the far side of Steelaway Ridge. Eyes crossed out, X's what were left, nameless what we saw we not saw. We ducked and ran, rained on by tree sap, dreaming, chattered at by wind and leaf stir, more than we'd have dreamt or thought. We lay on our backs, looking up at the limbs of the tree we lay underneath. Leaves our pneumatic book, we lay on our backs, unceased reprieves. North of us was all an emolument, more than we'd have otherwise run. We worked at crevices, cracks, convinced we'd pry love loose, wrote our names out 7 times in dove's blood, kings and queens, crowned ourselves in sound. Duke was there, Prez, Lady, Count, Pharaoh came later. The soon come Congress we'd heard so much about, soon come even sooner, south. So there was a new move suddenly, blue but up-tempo, parsed, bitten into. All of us got our share. Pecks what had been kisses, beaks what once were lips, other than we were as we lay under tree limbs, red-beaked birds known as moony, what we were, heads crowned in sound, only in sound.
Heads crowned in sound, only in sound. As critic Luke Harley puts it, quote, "The peck of the moony bird is a kiss of lament, a denial of social kinship, a registration of a mutual orphaning between the we of a whole people and the Kaluli boy," end quote. Increasingly, then, sound is not a means of orientation so much as a register of displacement, a rasping net of echoes. As Nathaniel Mackey puts it, quote, "The specter of dispersed identity and community, staggered adjunction or address," or as I would put it, a kind of echo, ECHO, poetics. The break with conventional meaning is brought about by a breach of social contract, a deprivation of community in the middle passage, where the becoming bird of Mackey's poem, Sound and Semblance, opens a whistling fissure blown on like a flute. To conclude, Jacques Derrida urges us to deconstruct the singular animal, that criminal, quote, confounding of all non-human beings under the common and general category of the animal, as he puts it. As a protest, Derrida's Ecce Animo lodges the humanist's cogito acoustically between animals, animo, and word, mo. Or as Giorgio Agamben writes, quote, "If the caesura between the human and the animal passes first of all within man, then it is the very question of man and of humanism that must be posed in a new way. What is man if he is always the place and at the same time the result of ceaseless divisions and caesurae?" End quote. These are the divisions, the discrepant engagements, the segments and caesurae that poems scan when they sound the animal. The cultural work our age of extinction calls for may not be so much to promote habitat preservation, but, as biogeographer Ellen Christ provocatively states, to ourselves become island preserves of animality. Or as Charles Bernstein again puts it, to attend to, quote, language's animality, A-N-I-M-A-L-A-D-Y, to attend to language's animality when the performance of language moves from human speech to animate but transhuman sound. How, to hear them, can we listen as animals? So we were going to conclude with a call, one more little call and response, like 8 minutes, and then open it up to questions. Is that okay, Christina? Or yeah, okay. And so I'm going to read some short poems, and Bernie's going to play some sounds. And these are poems from my little collections here. On stepping outside to hear the moonlight, for Jonathan Williams. A barred owl whispers my name in low tones. Never heard one so close.
Oops.
You're going to want the sound.
Yes.
Sorry. I'll start over. On stepping outside to hear the moonlight, for Jonathan Williams. A barred owl whispers my name in low tones. Never heard one so close. Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan. After poking around with a light, I wait under the pine tree. A duck whirs upriver, looking for open water. The ice cracks, settles to an outgoing tide. A jet passes over. The neighbor's dog barks. That old owl keeps silent, won't stir for no one, may be gone already. Sap moon growing, crows hunt worms at the snow's edge. A wind's in the boughs, says hello, Jonathan. You can play that outside. Poem for Lorene. So wood would whistle, so tits would twitter, and bees in the dark buzz, so all would hum, doves rock the rooted blossom. landscape with yellows. Yellows, heat waves, mewling catbirds, cardinals, what's up? Thrum of beast depressed branch, blackbirds shrill, sun-saturated days. No presidents know such frog pluck, such whinnying ducks and creaks of geese, pumped with bulls, nights not cooler, no such golden moons and common tassels grazed with late rain and pierced with low flying blackbirds. You can just go to the next one. Just two islands of flat ice water rotate, drifting down coast. A pair of golden eyes whir and skim. The surface, legs folded in arms folded. The sweetest drop of human honey, this gift. The giving and the drift in calm, thawing light. On reading John Donne at the farm, 'tis year's midnight and the days, humming of fridge, stove pops, coyotes whistling on the hill. Listen for the cock's crow, heading back down the ecliptic. Time to groom the medicine wheel. An utter blackness, just dark. The world's whole sap is sunk. The soul stress lies on the night. Dog stretched out by the stove. Cats on top of one another, getting ready to sleep tight. Thank you. I'll kick off. Are you going to ask me a question? Thank you. This evening reminds me a little bit of a story that Gregory Bateson once told to his graduate students
There was a story that while we were walking through the yard today, I was reminded of. And the story goes that when Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher, came to Harvard to lecture after World War I, he would only come under the condition that he could bring his good friend Bertrand Russell with him. And when people came to Harvard at that time, they had to give a talk before the entire community describing what they were going to do and how they were going to develop their programs. And of course, Whitehead and Russell always had this kind of conflict going on at the same time. It was very friendly. So Russell chose to describe in an hour's talk the quantum theory, Max Planck's quantum theory. And it was a hot August night, and all of Boston society was there in the chapel. And Whitehead got up and introduced Russell, and Russell labored for an hour to try to describe this quantum theory. And he was finished, and he was drenched in sweat, and he walked over to he kind of figured he lost his audience. He went and sat down. When Whitehead got up, walked up to the podium, and he said, in his high-pitched English voice, which I can't imitate, he said, "I'd like to thank Professor Russell for his brilliant exposition, and especially for leaving unobscured the vast darkness of the subject." That's how I feel about sound and soundscapes. Anyway.
Well, as I was listening to that last piece, which I really wanted to end it with, just because on a personal note, that's actually recorded in the panhandle of southern New Mexico. It's the piece titled Desert Solitudes, which accompanies your book. But I was thinking about this sort of naked ear of the microphone idea and recalling the conversation we had about it. I mean, I was kind of thinking about what went into making this amazing recording. You had a pretty interesting response to that idea. I mean, Hildegard Vesterkamp basically says, like, the microphone is kind of like a traveler in a foreign country. If you've ever monitored, I really recommend just putting on headphones with a recording device, even if you don't record. It's like a whole new world, of sound and it's partly just as I was trying to leave unobscured. The idea that you're like disconnected from sound and you don't know where the sound's coming from, but you're hearing in a way. The microphone is not discriminating in the way that your ears discriminate. We have all these filters built in, but the microphone kind of just picks everything up. I mean, that's the idea. And Hildegard Vesterkamp calls it the naked ear, but you had an interesting response to that.
Because many people think that the microphone is ubiquitous. I mean, it's an instrument, and every microphone is alike. The little mics that we have here on our heads right now are similar to some of the other mics that we would find out or that would record a symphony orchestra, for instance, but they're all very different, and they all have very different functions. They have different patterns, and they have different sensitivity, and they're different, many different types. And there are many, and people think that, well, you're able to record a stereo recording. We were at this conference recently in Wisconsin at Aldo Leopold's place, and we were talking about microphones, and this one guy came up and gave a talk about how stereo sound affects people psychologically. Well, there are probably 100 different forms of stereo sound, stereo miking processes. And so what do you mean that stereo gives us some kind of psychological benefit or is stress? And so for me, you really need to know something if you're going to talk about microphones or set this kind of thing up. Dorothea Lange said a camera is a device to teach us how to see. Well, a microphone is a device to teach us how to listen a little better. And the only reason that I would ever recommend to people going out and recording, and I recommend that all the time, is to try to learn something about the world and hear it from a little different perspective than what we normally hear with our ears. And microphones focus in on things in ways that we just don't ordinarily hear with our naked ears. And the naked microphone is kind of a misleading concept to me. Of course, every recordist has his own personal or her own personal tastes. And so you have to go with that as well, because we always find things that we like and sounds that we like and so on. But anyway, that was a long way of saying a short thing.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Before we open up, just one other thing I want to ask you. I couldn't let it go by. Is it's Cage's 100th birthday, and we talked a bit about John Cage, and
Hope he's feeling all right.
His response. I'm sure he's doing fine wherever he is.
Yeah.
But his response to soundscape recording and this sort of notion of finding sound in the world and then representing it as if you want to call it art or a composition. And anyways,
we had this curious.
You had an exchange with Cage.
Yeah, I knew him from the 1950s, and he had this curious way of describing things, sometimes a little oblique and others right on the money, and he very often contradicted himself. And we were at this conference at Lucasfilm, Skywalker Ranch in Marin County, and in 1989, and I asked him what he thought about folks who are claiming that they go out into the field and record without editing. And he had this curious response. He said, he thought for a moment, I have to read this because I forget his exact words, and they're interesting. He responded kind of tersely and a little disparagingly. He said, "Found art," he sniffed. He said, "That's because all true artists know that germane to their respective crafts is transformation. The inspired conversion of sound or image from one medium to another, or ideas from mind to page, ultimate expressions far more resounding than the sources from which they spring. It is through the process of insurgency that art in any medium obliges insight into the numinous and improbable. Transformation is the key to life and its expression through art, the real mystery of creative nature. Attempts to replicate or capture aspects of the natural world without amendment speak clearly to a vision of paralysis and death." Little hyperbole there, but there's John Cage at his best.
And your response?
I'm still silent. I don't know what to say sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just, in talking to you, and listening to your recordings, and I become acutely aware of what an art it is. How much forethought and technique and design goes into. Again, you say to me again and again, "Oh, that's not edited." That one was many recordings that I thought were edited. That you had sort of mixed together or layered. They're straight
That's
shots.
a real interesting point, because when you're recording, when you choose from these hundreds of different kinds of microphones and systems, because you like to hear a certain sound in a certain way, that's an edit. So when you choose your equipment, you're always making your first edit. When you choose your setup where you're going to record in the natural world or in an urban center, and you aim your mics in a certain direction to pick up certain kinds of sound, that's another edit, that's another decision. When you choose which kinds of sound you're going to play for people, like which sounds were on that album, or any of those albums, you've made another edit, because in a CD, in a regular CD format, you have only a limited amount of time to put material on that album, on that particular medium. So every time we go into the field, we're editing, and anybody who says that we're not editing, well, it's kind of a red herring. It doesn't mean very much, because we're editing all the time. And the best thing is that in the natural world is always editing for best transmission and best reception. So it's constantly in a state of mutation, so the critters can hear one another. Every day is different. People say that, when you go and record in a rainforest, you're recording a particular moment of sound. It'll never be the same in your entire lifetime. It's always transforming.
Well, maybe we should open it up to... that was a great answer, by the way.
I wish I'd thought of it then.
That's okay. Yeah. Other questions from the audience at this point? There are a couple microphones going around, and
I wanted Bernie to repeat a description that something he said to me about the first time you went out in the field in Muir Woods and listened to a binaural with headphones, listening to recordings in the real world, and I think it had a tremendous influence on your choice of how you spent the next 30 years.
Yeah, did everybody hear that, by the way? Okay. I'd gone out into, I talked about this earlier on, I walked as part of the album In a Wild Sanctuary, and I went into the woods, in Muir Woods, just north of San Francisco, to record natural sounds, because that was part of our obligation to the material that we were doing. And the first time I saw, it wasn't really binaural, it was stereo. And the first time I turned on those microphones, I mean, the whole world opened up in a different way for me. And I'd been working in a studio all the time with guys and gals smoking and doing all kinds of stuff, which I won't talk about here. And it was really getting boring, and it was getting oppressive to me. I found all day and all night I was inside these rooms where nothing else was coming in except the music that was being played. And when I turned on that recorder for the first time and heard that sound outside, I took a deep breath, and I heard sound like I'd never heard before, and I felt so relaxed. You know, I have a terrible case of ADHD. I've had it as a kid, and I have it as an adult. And the only thing that really relaxes me, well, two things, reading and listening to natural sound. I can't imagine anything that makes me feel better. Jonathan once, we were having these dialogues back and forth during the last couple of months, and at one point he says, "Why do you do that?" And without missing a beat, I said, "Because it makes me feel good." So for those of you who are under stress and you feel, you know, weird, and you're taking all kinds of stuff, forget it. Go out into the woods and listen to this stuff. It's marvelous, and it'll relax
Do they
you.
need a recording device?
No.
That's what interests me in your narrative is, I mean, to interject, is just the mediation of that experience. I mean, that you went out into the woods, but you put on headphones.
Well,
which is fascinating. And that's kind of like, I feel like when I go out in the world with my pen and I write a poem, you know, it's kind of, I think where I connected in this conversation with you is that there's the medium that's facilitating the connection.
A recorder can help.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like I said, you know, like Dorothea Lange talked about the camera,
Yeah.
making us see better. The recorder can do that. It certainly did it for me, and it did it very quickly. But for other people, and Murray Schafer, the Canadian I was talking about, the guy that wrote Tuning of the World, he recommends just going out and listening and being aware of the soundscape, being aware of the sources that are creating sound or noise in your life. Which do you like? Which engage you? Which kind of make you feel bad and stressed? And try to find environments that make you feel refreshed. Anybody else?
So you talk about this idea of reception as well as, and when you immediately said that at the beginning, I was struck by this idea of, so when you put something out there, like a poem or like a soundscape, the reception of your audience, so what they're hearing, what they're understanding, how they're taking it in, what they're feeling, is kind of like any art piece, right? But I also wonder, in your case particularly, you have very specific sounds that represent very specific either birds or glaciers or environments. And I was just wondering, one, how important you think it is to then know what it actually is, or whether there's a relationship or a reaction that might just be like any other art piece that may or may not be what your intention is or what the recording was of, and it's just more of like a personal reaction.
That's a really good question. Jonathan and I were talking tonight, and Jonathan mentioned at dinner that one of the things that was going to be a component of our presentation tonight was not to identify the individual creatures that are part of it, because it's distracting. And it's true, it is distracting. What I do in my work is I just listen and record, and I really don't care what's out there as long as it sounds right to me. And when it's an environment that's healthy, it makes me relaxed. When it's an environment that's under stress or change, like in an urban environment, for instance, where you're hearing sparrows compete all the time for position in the sound field, it causes me stress, because I know that I get the feeling that they're under stress, and certainly when people have done research at Montana State University, for instance, on wolves and elk and the stress hormone levels, how they elevate when noise is present, human noise is present, it really makes a difference. So no, I'm not concerned about what's there in the beginning, but when I'm archiving my material, I'm really concerned about the metadata. I want to know what's there. I want to know what the sources of sound are. So at some point, like some of the jobs that I've had were to reconstruct whole habitat sound, like during the Cretaceous period. And from the fossil records and known critters that are still alive, you can actually reconstruct that ambience. And we've been doing that for 15 years now, just by doing these spectrograms that I showed. So, the answer is really twofold.
Actually, with Hildegard Westerkamp, the essay in which she discusses the naked ear of the microphone, the point she wants to make actually is that context should be provided, she argues. It's the responsibility of the recordist to provide context, and that's why, in fact, in her recordings, you'll hear her voice in the soundscape narrating what's happening or providing some kind of reflection or language or context.
That's right.
But I find that when I teach soundscape or play recordings for audiences or students, the first thing that especially the kids want to know, they want to go identify the sound. What is that? What am I hearing? What am I hearing? And likewise, when I teach poetry, there's this impatience to get to the meaning or the message of the poem, or some frustration that arises when the reader doesn't feels like the poem has to be cracked somehow like a code. And for me, the listening to soundscapes and listening to poetry have a lot in common in that sense of like slowing the language down, articulating, sounding it, and just sort of letting go of that need for a message or the sort of looking past it to, because as soon as you identify it, you stop listening. At the same time, context is important, and that comes. I like to bring that in after we've listened.
Yeah, Linnaeus taught us well.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, we'll take 2 more questions. Yes.
I'm very curious as how you go to the field and to do the recording. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more in detail, like what do you bring, how much, and just how. I'm so curious. Or if you have photo of, that you're working in the field, so that I get a kind of a visual and experience of your experience.
Do you have a week? I've got a plane early tomorrow morning. I use digital recording equipment that's pretty high end, and a pair of microphones that the system that I use is called an MS system, mid-side, because it's much more robust than most of the other stereo formats that are out there, like ORTF or XY and so on. I like that because it gives me much more range when I want to do my editing and playback later. And I do a lot of installations in public spaces, so it makes a really big difference. And really, at the high end of the industry in film and recording, MS is the way to go. So I use that, and my system is very, very simple. I can throw it all in a backpack and travel for a month with batteries and everything in a backpack because the technology is so great now. I mean, there are recorders that can record with a couple of AA batteries, the small AA's, for 24 hours running constantly now. So, I mean,
size of a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah.
You can stick it in your pocket and just...
Yeah, it weighs 6 ounces. Yeah. And so I would encourage and they're not expensive. They're in the $200 to $300 range. And I would, and they're every bit as good as the $15,000, $20,000 pieces of gear we were using 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Are you talking like Zoom, the small Zoom?
I can't hear you. What?
The small, what is it?
The Zoom, yeah. The Marantz makes a nice one. I have a Marantz, and I walk around, and it's great. It's like a Walkman, so people think I'm just listening to my iPod, and I have headphones, and I'll like, I've recorded in the MTA and traveling through Boston, walking through city streets, out in the wilds, and just start recording, and
Olympus.
take it with you.
Olympus also has several different kinds. And they're very, very good recorders. And I just encourage everybody to, buy one and go out there and start recording. It's wonderful to do. But
Don't wear noisy clothing.
yeah, but pay some attention. Pay some attention to what the sources are. Yeah, that's really key.
Mm-hmm.
One more question.
How about two more?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll have two more.
Jonathan mentioned the similarity in the sort of state of mind elicited by the soundscapes and the poetry, but I was finding just listening to you that it was challenging to shift from listening to the soundscapes to listening to the poetry, and I often missed, like I felt like I wanted to be listening to one a little bit longer, or I was ready to be back in the other. So I was wondering if you had ideas or experiences of a different kind of attention actually being called on in either one.
It was challenging to put together, and it's frankly an experiment, and I'm not sure we succeeded, but I feel, the first pieces I wrote in response to listening to his recordings seemed more successful to me, but it's definitely a different, I wonder if there's even just different parts of the brain that are turned on. And a part of my talk I cut out is a physiologist, Reuven Suhr, a neuro-linguist, Reuven Suhr, who, sorry, not the McCaffrey, who looks at poetry as emerging from what he calls a pre-speech mode. So it taps into this pre-speech mode, which is closely tied to our, sort of childhood psychological experiences, and that there's actually a switch in our brain that switches on where we go from hearing sound to hearing words. And then he did experiments like if you cut the first part of the word off, what you call the attack, like in the acoustic profile of a word, we can't make head or tail of it. But you could cut 80% of the tail part of the word off, and so much meaning is embedded in those consonants. Like as we know, ancient languages were written, there were no vowels in Greek, and Hebrew is written and traditionally. So much meaning is embedded in those consonants. There's something in our brain that switches on, we start to hear code, and poetry kind of urges us to, nudges us toward that pre-semantic hearing, would be an argument. And there are probably other reasons for which, I don't know if you have, it's a rough transition.
Yeah, I think we did really great.
Yeah, last question.
Yeah, one more.
How would you record the sound of plants, or how would you record the sound of plants or, say, soil microorganisms? What's that oral characteristic?
You thought you'd get me, huh?
No, this isn't a trick question. This is a real question.
Okay, my first job working for a film company in Los Angeles, I was on the set as a sound recordist. And they wanted badly to fire me because I knew nothing. But they couldn't because I was in the union. Go figure. So instead, he sent me to Iowa to record corn. Okay? And I sat there in this field about 40 miles from Des Moines, excuse me, all night long, trying to record this corn growing. And you know what? Corn makes noise when it grows, because as it telescopes at night and grows an inch and a half or so each night on a hot August night, it squeaks. So you can actually record the sound, the signature of corn growing. Okay. Second thing is that I have a tree, although I'm trying to be serious. We had this, I had this sound of a tree cavitating in my book. What happens is, it's thought that when, in the xylem and the phloem of the trunk of a tree, that when the tree is going through a period of drought, the cells in the xylem and the phloem try to suck in air to maintain osmotic pressure. When they dry and they suck in too much air, they burst. And so we heard this high-pitched tone. We were recording bats one night, and we heard this high-pitched tone. And the closer we got to this tree, the louder it got. So we figured it was coming from the tree. It was 2.5 octaves beyond what we can hear, around 70 kilohertz, for those of you who are acoustically oriented. And so we drilled a little hole in the tree and inserted a hydrophone and recorded it on an instrumentation device and got this 70 kilohertz tone. What was happening was, when we slowed it up by a factor of 7, we got this. And what was happening was the cells were bursting, and we were actually getting the sounds of the cells bursting. Of course, when they burst, they die and they form the rings on the tree. But what was happening with this 70 kilohertz tone, it was drawing insects to the tree because they knew there was going to be food and sap. And then birds are drawn to the tree because they know there's going to be insects. So it was very cool. So yes, plants do make noise. And as far as critters in the soil, we've recorded things as small as viruses and worms moving their way through the soil. So yeah, a lot of stuff is happening there that we don't know about, and we're just beginning to find out. And all this is happening in the last 20, 30 years. Thank you for your question. And thank you for coming tonight. This has been terrific. Thank you.